I wrote the Pantheon WordPress Coding Standard. What are coding standards? There's a library that exists out in the world called PHPCS or PHP Coding Standards, which is a framework for writing styling rules or checks. There's a similar package called PHP Stan, which does standard analysis on files. That's more about linting. This is more about style checks. There's nuance. I won't get into it, but there also exists a repository for the WordPress coding standards. WPCS is an implementation of PHPCS specifically for a WordPress environment. Many teams have developed their own implementation of WordPress coding standards, including custom rules or sniffs, or pulling rules from different base rule sets in PHPCS. There's VIP has their own, and VIPCS. HumanMade has their own coding standards, the HumanMade coding standards. This is important because coding standards exist to normalize the code written by a team. If you're a solo developer, you probably have your own standard of what looks right to you. But if you're working on a team, it's valuable to have a standard to use as a team so all of your code is consistent. Standards can reduce lost time too, especially if there's standards around proper spacing. Not having standards means that one developer might spend unnecessary time cleaning up or changing spacing around existing code rather than writing something more substantial. Coding standards for a specific code base, like WordPress, can guide newer developers toward proper or correct development practices. You'll find often in the WordPress coding standard, if you use a particular function, it says you use this and this other thing is probably more accurate in this context. This can be found in sniffs around proper escaping and sanitization functions or guidance against large database queries. I joined Pantheon from HumanMade 3 years ago, where at HumanMade we had developed and maintained our own coding standards, and in many ways, our coding standards were a living implementation of our engineering style guide. When I joined Pantheon, I immediately asked if there existed a Pantheon coding standard. I was pointed towards some broad engineering style guides, just the normal default PHP coding standards, but nothing that was specific to WordPress development at Pantheon. It's worth noting at this point that Drupal has a standard that's built into the devel module. So in the Drupal space, you're probably using that, and you're probably using the standards that exist for all of Drupal. WordPress coding standards are often as opinionated as they are idiosyncratic, and they are different distinctly from those Drupal standards. The rules for teams in the WordPress space are frequently different than the rules used to develop WordPress core. And I wanted to create a standard that we could use across all of our WordPress code to unify the coding style used in any WordPress project, particularly when we have a lot of people who come from a Drupal background or from other sort of development background who are not used to WordPress code and our idiosyncrasies. So I use the human-made coding standards as a base, including the practice of building a minimal rule set appropriate for more wide and loose usage, along with a stricter rule set to be used across all of our WordPress code bases. Why would anyone create their own coding standard? Well, fundamentally, you might create your own standard if you see an existing sniff in a standard and you disagree with the reasoning behind the rule. For example, WPCS has rules around aligning variable and array assignments. This means that if additional variables or array keys are added to the code, the developer adding those new variables need to make sure that all the values line up with each other with what was there previously, which also means that if your variable name is longer than any of the other variable names, then you have to add spacing to every other line in the stack, which creates unnecessary busy work just for the sake of readability. If you disagree with this one rule, you can create an exclusion for that rule. If you disagree with many of the rules, you might want to just make your own rule set, which is what I did for Pantheon. How do you use Pantheon's coding standard? I'm going to use a plugin that I wrote a long time ago as an example. I had not originally added coding standards. I had not originally done a lot of things with this. It's a very old plugin that I wrote about 10 years ago. Currently not using any kind of style checks or coding standard checks. It's also not using Composer, so I need to create a Composer file. I wasn't previously using Composer, and I had to add a Composer file in here. But once that's there, if you're using Composer, you can do a Composer require --dev, because it's a dev dependency, Pantheon systems / Pantheon WP Coding Standards. That --dev ensures that this is a development requirement and not necessary for live sites or for compilation when you're compiling the code. I like to create a PHPCS script in my Composer JSON so I can run Composer PHPCS to run my code against the coding standard. If I wasn't doing that, I would probably be using just the global PHPCS that's installed on my system, which means that I would need to have all of the standards installed on my system too. So using Composer in this context means that you can install the standards that you want, and those are already built into the PHPCS binary that is part of that project. So each of your projects can have a different standard, they can have a different PHPCS binary, they can use different rules, etc. The script might run a command that looks like this: vendor/bin/phpcs and some stuff after that. I can then write an action in GitHub Actions or whatever to run Composer PHPCS on every push or every push to a pull request to ensure the code is always checked for consistency. You could also add things like Git hooks to automatically run your standards locally and then share those with the rest of your team. Using Composer also means that you don't need to worry about installing the internal dependencies of the coding standard, like PHPCS itself, because those are already included when you're doing Composer require. I only needed to require Pantheon systems, Pantheon PHP coding or WP coding standards. I didn't need to do the requires of all the things that package itself required. It's one of the cool benefits of Composer. Now, if you want to customize the checks for your code base and exclude specific rules, you can do this by creating a phpcs.xml or phpcs.xml.dist or a .phpcs.xml. These are all valid file names that PHPCS knows to look for customizations to the rule set. And inside this file, you would declare the rules and rule sets that you want to use and those rules that you want to exclude. For a first pass, you might want to use the Pantheon WP minimum standard, and then eventually move up to the more strict Pantheon WP strict rule set when you're ready. A few examples of some customized rules that I have in my rule set include some VIP stuff that is not relevant to my environment. There are number-specific rules that I'm excluding on specific files. There's some rules that I'm ignoring globally. This particular plugin uses custom capabilities, so there's a check here that says WordPress doesn't know about these capability checks that it's doing. That's okay because I added those capabilities and I know that I did that, so I'm excluding that rule. You can also use coding standards to enforce code formatting to your code base. PHPCS comes with PHPCBF, which is the PHP Code Beautifier. PHPCBF uses a PHPCS rule set, and wherever possible, it'll make those changes that are relevant, that are required to enforce the standard. Most commonly, this is things like spacing. It doesn't always get it right, and in fact, it can really mess up your code when it gets it wrong. But most of the time, it does a pretty good job of fixing those sort of those simple spacing issues, and then you can always do a quick pass afterwards and when you're committing the code to your code base. You can also use PHPCBF in automation tools to automatically push those style changes to the code. Here's an example of where we did that in one of our Pantheon plugins, where on a pull request it runs a PHPCBF, and when it sees something that is not following the standard, it makes that change. It applies a commit to the repository. It adds a commit message saying apply code beautifier changes or whatever, and it will be in the Git history, and it'll give us a link to that commit so we can go and check it later in case we disagree and need to revert it or whatever. Let's dig in a little bit to adding the coding standard to this plugin. I will add this script. I'm just going to do copy paste into the Composer JSON file to get a shortcut, a script shortcut to be able to run PHPCS from Composer. Once that's done, I can run that check, and it's going to run on every file in the plugin, but it's not going to have a standard until I tell it what standard to use. So I'm going to start off with a really bare bones PHPCS file so that I can define a couple things, some properties for running the checks themselves. Pantheon WP Coding Standards includes PHP compatibility as one of its dependencies, and a WordPress compatibility specifically, so I can add that and add some properties having to do with PHP and WordPress versions. And then I define the rule set, Pantheon WP rule set. And I can also define the text domain for internationalization. In this case, it's book review library. That's a property that gets set so it knows what to look for there. And then I'm just going to run the check, and it's going to find a lot of problems. I spent about a day and a half going through all these things and fixing them. So now when I go to the branch that I have fixed up, all these things are already fixed. So I run the check and then all that stuff goes away. But you can see as I scroll through these checks, it tells you what it is. And one of the things that I do when I make my script is I add this -s parameter. And what this does is it tells you the name of the sniff. This is helpful because when you know the name of the sniff, you know the thing that you need to ignore. And sometimes I do an ignore inline in the code if it's just a one-line thing, and it's not gonna repeat. And sometimes I will add those ignores or exclusions to the PHPCS.xml file. And the reason why I would ignore a thing is because I know that it's a thing that I should be aware of, but it's not applicable in this specific context, or I'm aware of the problem, but I am intentionally offsetting or bypassing, or maybe I did something already to correct it. In another context, it's not getting picked up by the sniff. So one example is this plugin uses CMB2 to do an options page and various other things. CMB2 already has built-in nonce protection, so if I get a nonce error, then I know doing a CMB2 thing like saving settings, I know the nonce is already there, and I know I've already checked it. So I don't necessarily need that particular sniff telling me that I didn't do a nonce check. And especially when you put this stuff into automation, when you add this stuff to your GitHub repository or whatever, and it becomes a check that happens or needs to pass, perhaps, you can make this a required check on GitHub, then that means that you want those green check marks. You want all of your tests to pass. So you don't want to be failing a check that is required or mandatory on a thing that you know is already covered. Another example is there's cases in this plugin where I use camel case instead of snake case. In this context, I'm not going to go through and change all the variable names to make them all snake case. I don't really care that much about camel case, so I'm just going to make a global exclusion of that rule so that I'm not getting dinged for the wrong formatting of my variable names. It's not an important thing for me. Obviously, you can apply PHPCS rules to more than just a plugin. In this context, in this example, I've used a plugin, but you can apply these rules to your entire code base as well. And in those cases, you will also want to set up a series of ignores, right? You're not going to want to run PHPCS sniffs against a bunch of plugins that you've installed on your in your site that you don't maintain. There's no point in getting alerts about things that aren't your code. So in those cases, you would add those paths to your exclusions list for any plugins that you don't control, so that only the code that you have added, your theme code, your custom plugins, maybe MU plugins, whatever, only that code is getting sniffed. And then you can make sure that across the entire code base, for all of the code that you are responsible for, that you have a consistent style being enforced, or at least being checked against. The Pantheon WP Coding Standard has helped ensure that new code to any of our various WordPress projects remains consistent and easily maintainable. I encourage you to try using our coding standards. Among other things, our standards are always a work in progress. They are based on a lot of existing standards with certain exclusions for Pantheon environments, but there are likely many instances where we're still running rules on things that aren't necessary and didn't just come out when I was testing them against all of our plugins. And so the more different ways the rule set is used, the more we can address those issues. I found a couple as I was going through this plugin that I wrote a long time ago that I'm going to be adding to the next version of the Pantheon WP Coding Standard. I hope this has been helpful. I really think that it's a valuable tool to add to any sort of toolkit that you have on either a site or a plugin or a theme or whatever you're using. And if you're using PHPCS or some other coding standards, WordPress coding standards, or if you're using our WordPress coding standards, or if you would like to learn more about how to use our WordPress coding standards, let us know in the comments, in the community Slack, and I'd love to chat more about standards.